Hi, good afternoon. My name's Vicki Page-Clark and I'm the founder and director of Lighthouse Pharmacovigilance Limited, a consultancy company that offers qualified person for pharmacovigilance and other pharmacovigilance solutions. So I'm here today to discuss the impact of Brexit, as with my colleagues, but really looking specifically at more of the impact on small and medium-sized enterprises, so SMEs, and subcontractors, and what it may mean for more of this sub-area of the pharmaceutical field. So in terms of what I'm looking to cover today, I wanted to go back and have, while you've heard this no doubt quite a lot throughout the day, I wanted to remind us of what Brexit actually means, what it covered, and maybe more importantly, what it didn't cover in its remit. And to look at some of the initial reaction to Brexit, particularly from our friends with the regulatory authorities. Then to look at some of the considerations for SMEs and subcontractors and how perhaps it's different from larger companies. Why are they different? What are some of the things that need to be considered? And then to go on to look at what can you, if you're an SME, do apart from pull your hair out and run away. Then moving on to look at subcontractors, again another specialist field. What can you do if you're a subcontractor? Do you need to do anything? Are there any opportunities out there, for example? And then finally looking to summarise everything and to see, is there any action we need to take now? What should we really take away from this? So just in case anyone wasn't aware, the UK voted in a referendum Thursday 23rd of June whether to remain or stay in the European Union. One of the things that has been quite an area of confusion, I think, is there's been an evolving role within Europe. So this was a vote about leaving the political union, the European Union. It wasn't, for example, talking about leaving the geographic area, if that would even be possible, the European Free Trade Area, the European Economic Area. So there are all these different models, and we'll come back to why that's important slightly later on. So the UK voted to leave the EU by quite a narrow margin, it's fair to say, but in terms of the number of votes, it was nearly 1.5 million more for the leave side. The other interesting point to note is, being a referendum and not an election, for example, there was no manifesto in place, so neither side had a plan for post-referendum for saying this is how it will look post-referendum should the UK leave. So while that's understandable for a referendum, it was similar, for example, when there was the vote in the UK on whether Scotland should leave or become an independent country or not. It does mean that now we're in this area where there's a lot of uncertainty, and as we know, for businesses, for the financial markets, this creates a lot of discomfort and uncertainty because people just want to know what is going to happen. So obviously there are a number of ways that Brexit could happen. We'll start to talk about hard and soft Brexit, for example, but while no one has left yet, there is actually something in the treaty. So it's in the Treaty on the European Union, otherwise known as the Lisbon Treaty. There's something called Article 50. So this allows a member state to leave the European Union, and there's a period of up to 2 years, after which it can only be extended if it has consensus from all member states. So while the UK doesn't have to use this, it's just to highlight that there is actually a mechanism for them to do it. The other interesting point we'll come on to talk about is around the timeline and what that means for your negotiating position. So obviously there was it's fair to say, quite a reaction in the media, both in the UK and abroad. Obviously there is a lot of shock at the decision and the uncertainty and what does this mean. And the first thing to say, until the UK formally leaves the European Union, it is business as usual. It seems an odd thing to say when we're talking about the impact and do we need a plan B and so forth, but the MHRA and EMA, for example, have been very keen to say that it is business as usual. We are still a full voting member of the committee, such as CHMP, for example, or PRAC for our safety colleagues. and obviously PRAC being chaired by the MHRA, Dr. Rain, that's clearly very important. And they've both made statements to this effect which are included in the slides for your reference. It's also to say the regulatory framework again hasn't changed, so if you're a client that wishes to submit a new license, a centralised license, you wish to submit an authorisation where the UK is asked for scientific advice or the UK is rapporteur, or you already have one under review, these things aren't changing, and they won't change even once Article 50 is invoked, because as we said before, there is a period of up to 2 years. So while it's important to plan, say if there's a product in earlier development and clearly you want to start thinking medium and longer term, and things may change, for now there is no change to the regulatory framework and the UK's rights. That also applies to, for example, the rules for trade, for movement across borders, for migration and so on. There's also no current change in the role of the European QPPV. So for example, because we're still a member state within Europe, the UK QPs can still be based in the UK, pharmacovigilance systems can still be based in the UK, and it carries on as normal. That being said, given the uncertainty, despite the positions and you could say the pleas for calm from the authorities, clearly some companies are choosing to move their QP, perhaps in anticipation, away from the UK. So while there is no official reason to change, we are already seeing an impact with people moving their systems to other countries in Europe. So on that note, it's the uncertainty that is causing perhaps the issues, while in reality nothing has changed. Part of the reason for that is the UK Parliament hasn't set out its position yet. So this is causing a lot of difficulties because there is, for example, a minister for so-called Brexit, but they haven't yet released plans and there isn't yet a timetable beyond what we know from Article 50. So there are many questions, for example, do we even need to use Article 50? Will it be a so-called hard Brexit, which is where the preference for migration controls takes preference? So if that means losing access to the single market, that is seen as acceptable if you're supporting a hard Brexit. Or will it be a so-called soft Brexit, where the financial passporting, the access to the single market is seen as more important than the stricter controls on migration? The short answer is no one knows. Obviously there are preferences given by lots of different companies, but again the uncertainty if you're an SME in this space is you're not having as much of a voice into the discussions and you're not sure which would be the preferable scenario for your company. Adding to this difficulty is there's no longer a dedicated Minister for Life Sciences, so there was previously someone who worked specifically with our industry to ensure that our interests are represented. And as we said previously, this was a referendum across the whole UK. It was really a matter for UK Parliament to look at our relationship and how interests are taken across the country. It wasn't specific for any one industry, and there wasn't any kind of plan to say how different sectors, such as the pharmaceutical industry, would be covered. It sounds very obvious, but it is important to say because we don't know how our interests will be represented, and not having someone within the cabinet does make it that bit harder, which is why we'll go on to see the role of some of the social networks and some of the consultation groups are so important. So what are some of the things to think about for, particularly if you're a small and medium-sized enterprise? So there are some unique challenges, and perhaps if we first look at some of the things that makes it easier for these larger companies, so for example GlaxoSmithKline, AstraZeneca, etc., that they can perhaps cope with what Brexit has thrown at them easier. So first of all, they have more of an infrastructure, so both in and outside of Europe. If, for example, the EMA offices were to move to another country, or it was necessary for the QP to move to another country, these larger companies tend to have more of a structure in all of their countries. So if the QP does need to move to, say, Germany or to Ireland, for example, they're much more likely to have a setup there already. They'll have contacts, they'll have local regulatory intelligence. It will be much easier for them to absorb this kind of change without the kind of impact that you'd expect from an SME. They're also able to use their performance across the whole company globally. So obviously due to currency fluctuations, due to the uncertainty we've mentioned before, there have been some drops in the market, and there's also been some uncertainty, which has meant we've seen drops in financial performance and financial results for companies, and particularly in the UK market. So if you're an SME that is perhaps only based in the UK, you're going to feel that impact a lot more than if you're a much larger company with, say, 50 to 100 plus offices, both in and outside the UK, where perhaps you're working with different currencies. You can set off some of the results and you can balance it with stronger results from elsewhere. In contrast, if you're an SME, again, you have much less of a global infrastructure, and overall you have much less of a voice. So we've obviously seen some of the groups such as the Association British Pharmaceutical Industry, ABPI, and the Bioindustry Association, BIA, taking quite a strong lead. So if you're, as we say, AZ, GSK, Amgen, for example, it's quite easy to ensure that your voice is heard. Whether it's listened to is perhaps a different discussion for another day, but if you are a larger company, as well as the infrastructure, you're also very much an active part of that discussion. You can ensure the points relevant to your company are heard and that you're having that active discussion. You're also very keyed into what the issues are, and you're thinking about your strategic view, and you're thinking, okay, this is what we need to consider, this is how we change our business's plans. If you're an SME, you may not have as much of an internal role for that. You may rely a lot on outside consultants, and a lot of your business may be in the UK. So then if your consultants need to move, for example, or to change the focus of their work, something we'll come on to, it makes it a lot harder to know where you can go to for advice. It's also much harder when it comes to having concerns over resourcing and managing employees, because again, if you're a small team, if you have perhaps 100 employees, say 10 of your employees need to either leave because they have concerns over remaining in the UK, or it's harder to now attract talent to the UK, which is again something else that we've seen since the referendum result. That impact is going to be much more strongly felt if you're a SME of 100 people than if you're a larger pharma of, say, 10,000 plus people. And again, it's when we're talking about the pharmaceutical industry and we're talking about very highly qualified technical people, not being able to attract someone of this caliber is going to have devastating impact on you if you're an SME. And finally, it's really looking, something we'll come on to with the subcontractor side, but if the subcontractors need to move, for example, many SMEs, they either outsource their pharmacovigilance function and their QPPV function completely. If that person does need to move from the UK, it's sometimes hard to know where to find good people. It's something we see with resourcing, but it's also worth saying on the vendor selection side, it's hard to find a good service provider, and we're seeing quite a change in the market for service providers, that there are people who are moving, there are people who are no longer offering certain services because they feel that the longer term market will not be there in the UK. So the market is always changing, and if you're an SME, sometimes it's hard to get access to that information, to know who you can trust and where you can get that good quality information from. So raising lots of problems, but what can you, if you're an SME listening to this, what can you do to address and to try mitigating some of these risks that we're discussing? So the first thing to say, after panicking many of you, is to say keep calm and carry on. It is still business as usual. As SMEs will know, it's always noses to the grindstone anyway, so it's very much a case of the business is still there, the markets are still there, we still have patients, prescribers to serve, so it is still business as usual. That being said, using contractors and service providers, it can have two sides. There are some concerns that we raised in the previous slide, but it can also be helpful because they service many clients. If you're not able to access some of these industry association groups directly through your company, often a good service provider will have that access, and they will be able to keep you informed about what is happening, and perhaps even to raise some of the concerns from your company on your behalf. So it's very much a case of keeping, up to date through your service providers and contractors, and also checking the likes of LinkedIn and other groups on there. Certainly there are several groups, of which some are given in the presentation, links that have been set up for example, qualified persons in the UK who are working towards what we need to do. But there are other groups there who are looking at the interest of smaller and medium-sized companies, and also some product-specific areas. So, for example, looking at the concerns of biologics and biosimilars, looking at concerns of consumer health and over-the-counter products, and looking at concerns of generic companies. Because while we all work with the same regulations, there are differences depending on the size of your company and the kind of products in your portfolio. So given that there's a lack of coordination on the UK government side, one of the strongest messages we can say is that having that fragmentation on the industry side is really not going to help, because we're already having to work with quite a fragmented government organisation. So it's really important to make use of some of these, and it should be said, free resources through the likes of LinkedIn and using your consultant network, because that will be as important as ever through this ever-changing time. It's also trying to avoid making drastic decisions. It's often said when you're managing, for example, a stock portfolio, that where there's a drastic change, the first thing people want to do is to go in and withdraw their money, when maybe that's one of the worst things you can do, because the market will even out. While we've not seen something similar to Brexit before, it's a similar scenario. Going in and making drastic changes when the landscape isn't yet known, both politically and from the regulatory side, isn't wise. And that's one of the reasons really MHRA, EMA, etc., they're trying to plea for calm, because the last thing you should be doing really is to make drastic decisions around your licensing, over taking advantage of other commercial opportunities, because there are likely to be changes to the regulatory framework. There will have to be if the UK is no longer a member state, but to try and make those drastic changes now before it's even announced if the UK will be using Article 50, for example, may be unwise. So while it's not always possible, it's worth considering if there are any decisions on the commercial side that could possibly be held back. And currently it is thought that there may be decision in early 2017. There are a number of factors, such as the length of government that the current government has left before 2020, also European elections which are expected to take place Q2 in 2017. So while it's not always possible to hold back, it's worth considering thinking about your commercial decisions at this time. Another factor to consider is taking advantage of currency fluctuations. While it's not always possible for those who are working in more than one country and outside the UK, there is a weaker pound. Certainly just after the result, the pound lost a fair amount of value, while there has been some recovery. For our clients who are outside the UK, they certainly are seeing those services cheaper, which is perhaps from the services side it's challenging, but if you are working with a service provider and you are the client yourselves, it could be an unexpected benefit. So it's something to bear in mind, particularly if you are going through contract negotiation or you're working with those providers on a short-term basis. As we've already said, being sure to network is really one of the things that can help you most. Even if it's a case of you want to find a consultant, you want to ask what you think are simple questions: where do I get information, what has been released so far. There are a number of links that we've provided in the group, but you could do a lot worse than using the links that several of myself and my colleagues earlier in the day have mentioned about other groups on LinkedIn, other groups through some of the industry associations. And if you're not sure where to go, one of the first steps you can take is just to ask any of us directly. We'd be happy to help. So we've mentioned a fair amount about SMEs, so small and medium-sized enterprises. What about from the other side, if you're actually providing services as a subcontractor? What are the things that you need to consider? Again, the first thing to say is until we leave, it's business as usual. So particularly if you're a subcontractor, the current rules around free movement within the European Union and migration, it remains the same. So whether it's you need to hire people for your own services company, whether it's you wish to work across the union, the same rules still apply and will do for up to 2 years past Article 50. Again, as we've said, while currency fluctuations work both ways, that can work in your favour, particularly if you're working with non-UK clients. So while they're looking to perhaps the negative side of the uncertainty, it's a good counter-argument myself and other colleagues have found that you can say about what it means for your service price. One thing to add is that around the regulatory framework, there's been a lot of discussion about what will it mean for European QPPVs who are based in the UK. Now, there's already been some discussion on this earlier in the day from one of my colleagues, Miranda Dolan, but right now it's not possible to say anything other than for those who are here, it is business as usual. The MHRA haven't announced any plans about whether they will introduce a national UK local responsible person, although many think it is highly likely. Again, that's something that really will come out and it depends on the negotiating position, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of people think it's quite likely. One thing to note though is we're not just talking about drug safety, we're talking about the wider pharmaceutical industry. So even if there are restrictions and we're no longer a full European member state after we leave the Union and it is more of a hard Brexit, there will always be a market for good quality pharmaceutical contractors. So for example, for those of us who currently act as QPPVs, it may be that the QP support officers or the physicians who work with the QP, it may be that these people can be based outside the European Union, as in fact they are for some companies currently, even if the actual QP and deputy QP roles do have to be based in one of the other member states. As we just said, it's also possible that there will be national responsible persons for UK. And there are also a large number of other allied roles as we see the regulation take arms and legs and who knows what else. It's a huge scope of work and often, it needs really good quality contractors. So for example, some of the allied functions to the QPPV around training, around quality management system support, around regulatory intelligence, around these other kinds of areas like auditing and inspection preparation, it may be that people have to consider whether they move to another member state or whether they take on those other roles. And for many that will be a personal decision. That's not really something that the regulation can say what should happen. It's something that we're recommending that people start to consider now. So while you can look at it short term and say you can work with your existing contracts, medium to long term, people are looking realistically at either a move or to alter their view slightly. But one of the things we'd also add is that doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. I think it's fair to say many QPPVs, particularly for SMEs, are used to wearing many hats. So it may be a case of one hat is taken off and another is worn. And as we focus perhaps less on the EU, if we're looking at something such as regulatory intelligence, for example, or system improvement, there are a lot of other markets to assist. So everywhere from the Americas to perhaps Asia and other emerging markets. We're seeing increasingly for the Middle East, for example, in Australia, they're taking a lot of their references from some of the regulation that the UK had a large role in when they brought the European legislation in. So it's worth remembering, even if we leave the EU, we still have a huge body of talented individuals and people who fed into the regulation, and instead of feeding that into further changes in the European trading bloc, it may be that it goes to, for example, Middle East, Asia, Africa and some of the other emerging markets. Which leads nicely on to talking about opportunities with Brexit. It perhaps seems a little of a dirty phrase because many people, for a good reason, we do work within a very regulated industry, and so it's easy to focus on the negatives and what perhaps we're losing. But it's worth remembering that there is an opportunity here, and hopefully we can work with our government to take this. So the first thing to say, and again particularly for SMEs, there aren't many advantages being an SME with this, but this is one. There is a large pharmaceutical market within the UK, so this doesn't change significantly with the referendum result, and while there's perhaps discussion on some of the figures that have been traded by both sides, it's fair to say that with no longer having membership fees and with challenges within the health service already, for example, the increase in elderly population, newer, more complex therapies to support, there's always going to be a market at home. So for many of particularly the smaller and micro enterprises, those who are working with very innovative products, you may find that actually you can focus more on the domestic market, and it's worth remembering that that's not gone away. Obviously that doesn't cover all SMEs, so for those who continue to trade outside the UK, we've already mentioned around currency fluctuations, for example, but another thing that's worth remembering, and this is where it's important to have a consultation because it's an opportunity, but it's not yet fixed because the government has not released its position, is it may be possible to reduce the amount of regulation and so-called red tape that we have in the UK. Obviously, many of the regulations we have in the UK have come from European directives. Some of those have been very helpful to harmonise and to help us work together. But there is another counter-argument to say it has made doing pharmaceutical research, to sell and license our products, it's made it very complicated. And so one of the things to consider is, could we actually reduce some of that red tape? And that would really have an impact, particularly on SMEs. Again, if we go back to the examples earlier of larger pharmaceutical companies, if you have tens of thousands of people, you can work very well. You have lots of people to look into the regulations, to figure out what it means, to set up governance models, etc. If you maybe have 100 people or less in your entire company, that can seem very daunting, if not impossible. So one of the things that really excites me, certainly working with some of my SME clients, is the idea that we can be more nimble and that we can help people get their products to market quicker. And we can look at some of the things that the MHRA has really taken a lead in, European member or not, such as around adaptive licensing, around the earlier use of scientific advice, and to really work with them in terms of getting some of these products to market quicker and perhaps taking more of a risk-based approach. In terms of, is there a room for a lighter touch? Already you see it with herbal medicines and homeopathics, but perhaps in terms of some of the more well-established products, and move into, for example, what we see in Asia in terms of the re-examination model versus our renewal model. And it may be there's a case for lighter touch regulation with what we're seeing with generics, for example. In terms of being outside the EU, it may also allow for a more nimble and flexible discussion around, for example, free trade agreements, and also how migration policies are tailored. So while I would be the last to suggest that we should get rid of migration, our industry really depends on migration of experienced, well-qualified personnel. We need to consider whether we can do more to actually perhaps increase migration in some markets. So rather than working with quotas, being part of a trading bloc, is there an opportunity for providing more, if not a points-based system, something similar to that, to allow the highly qualified people, wherever they are in the globe, to work with us in the UK? And also similarly for free trade agreements, again, if we're working with world trade tariffs, we perhaps don't have the negotiated agreements through the European Union, but if we're one single country, it may actually be easier to arrange an agreement directly. So for example, South Korea has the highest number of trade agreements anywhere in the world, and they're quite a small country. Countries such as Chile and Switzerland are also much higher in terms of the agreements they have. Many of you will have heard of the so-called TTIP, the agreement between the US and the EU, and seen how cumbersome that is. Any time that you have to involve such a huge number of countries, there's always an element of compromise. Whereas if the UK can form those agreements with other countries directly, we may be cutting down again on the red tape and the burden there, and recognising that we still need to trade globally, but perhaps we can take a lighter, more risk-based approach, which is often the aim and music to the ears of many of our SME colleagues. So in summary, What are the points that I'd like you to take away from this? The first thing to say, as a reminder, that while everyone knows about a referendum, it's important to emphasise there was no formal plan. It was a referendum, it wasn't an election. There was no Brexit manifesto. Whether there should have been, I'm sure, is a discussion many of us could have separately. What this means is there are many uncertainties still to be worked out. Leading on from that, Brexit can mean many things, so until the UK government announces whether they're going to use Article 50, whether they're going to go for a hard or soft Brexit or something in between, it is business as usual. We are still a full European member state. All of the current directives, regulations, formalities still apply. In order to avoid not having the voice lost, it's essential for small and medium-sized enterprises and those subcontractor companies to work with other industry associations. That may be going by product portfolio, it may be going through national associations, it may be working with some of the groups that we're already seeing, but it's really important that we're working together and not providing a fractured voice, because as we've said, the government is already having to work on so many other industries. We need to make our point more clearly as one. And also not forgetting that domestic opportunities still apply, and this may provide a disproportionate amount of business and benefit for the small and medium-sized companies who don't have that global infrastructure, but again, there may be opportunities in the market at home. And while it is business as usual for the short term, it's certainly worth planning when we're thinking about free trade agreements, what we're going to do with other countries directly for the medium and long term. So while it's worth holding off on any drastic decisions in the immediate term, there's nothing to say you shouldn't start planning now for what could be quite an exciting opportunity. Thank you for your attention.